The cassette was no bigger than a book of matches, its label hand-printed in neat block letters M8 to 2893. When the wheels caught and the tape began to move, the tent held its breath. A young woman's voice rose through the hiss and the heat, thin, steady, unmistakably alive like a porch light burning in a storm. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. Most mornings that summer started the same way for me, flat irons lifting out of a pale, chalky sky, sunlight catching the stone like a slow spark, coffee cooling on a file cabinet, because I never finished it while it was hot. The older officers called our side of the building the museum. I didn't mind. Museums hold what a place refuses to forget. When I unlocked my office, the first thing I saw was a corkboard with faces from years that no longer felt real Polaroids and photocopies, hand-drawn maps, ledger lines in pencil that had faded to the color of straw. I kept the windows open whenever it stayed under 90 degrees, so I could hear lawn sprinklers stitching the morning and the occasional freight horn nudging the day awake down in the valley. That sound made the city feel smaller, containable, like the world had edges we could find and hold. By mid-August, the air tasted like campfire. Out west, the timberlands were burning again. Even in Boulder, ash drifted down in specks so fine they vanished on your sleeve. Inside the station, our days clicked along the soft thrum of the copier, someone's chair rolling over worn linoleum, a detective laughing too loud at something that wasn't funny, but broke up the quiet. On my desk sat a stack of overdue maintenance requests and a single cold case file. I rotated to the top every Monday the way some folks rotate which roses they water first. The file was thinner than it should have been for 31 years. A few photographs, some receipts, 2 typed forms with edges as sharp as they were the day they were stamped. When I turned that folder open, I didn't start with paperwork. I started with the 2 passport-size photos clipped to the inside cover. Young faces, summer squinting eyes, the kind of smiles you can still hear if you look long enough. You learn the morning rhythms of people you've never met. Megan's paperwork told me she liked early starts. Her time cards from the daycare in Boulder had check-ins at 7:02 a.m., 7:05, 7:01, never late, never loose. Ryan's graduate notes in the box were neat in the margins and messy in the middle, he thought, like a river straight lines until a bend. When I drove past the grocery on Arapahoe, I'd picture them pushing a cart through the produce aisle, Ryan testing melon skin with his thumb while Megan unfolded a paper list. That's what the world looked like the week before they set out, ordinary choices, small coins dropping into the bank of a life that felt durable. I still had my patrol habits even after years in detectives. Walk the lot first. Look for new dents, fallen glass, fresh oil on the asphalt. Say hello to the janitor because he knows what changed overnight before anyone else does. Then lights on blinds, half open, fan turned to low. I kept a mug on the sill and let the fan move the smell of coffee around the room. On the wall behind my chair, I taped a map of Grand County with transparent flags pressed into places hikers loved and places hikers never admitted they visited, old shafts where miners had worked the rock with their hands, fire roads that turned to gullies when the sky opened a chain of lakes that looked close until your boots met the grade. In our line of work, normal is not a word you say out loud. You hear it from other mouths in a neighbor's retelling of a last barbecue, a manager describing a worker who never took long lunches, but you don't say it yourself. Still, that month carried its own kind of calm. We were between big trials. The campus crowd hadn't moved back in force. The softball league that used our backlot hadn't started its fall games. Even the scanner settled into a lull after dark. I'd drive home on 28th Street with the windows cracked and let the evening sit on my shoulders. My apartment building is one of those brick stacks with a stairwell that smells like wet limestone after a rain. The neighbor 2 doors down waters her hibiscus at dusk, and if I get home at the right time, I can hear the potting soil sip and the leaves settle. People arrived in my life through doors and through paper, Lillian came by appointment. She's a small woman with quiet hands and a voice as careful as a hymn. The first time we met, she unpacked a brown envelope on my desk like she was setting a table birthday napkin, a concert ticket, a photo strip from a county fair booth with 4 frames stacked like the stages of a summer afternoon. I made notes while she talked, the kind that look cold when you read them back. Dropped off plant at church. Borrowed cooler from neighbor, took dog to groomer. But memory is built out of things like that, and if you listen long enough, a day opens up like a road map. Cal lived as a voicemail for a long time before I knew his face. Nothing unusual, just a name in my daybook under a number with the same 970 area code as the mountain towns. He moved through timber water, rock regulated what the land gave and took, and his calls when they came tended to be short. You learn to trust people who know how to keep things short. Lena, I knew well. She wears her hair pulled back and keeps her sleeves rolled past her elbows like she's about to lift a pane of glass. It's a kind of reverence, the way she handles brittle film and old photographs, as if the emulsion still remembers the air it met the day it was made. We've stood shoulder to shoulder in red light waiting for an image to climb out of the tray, speaking in a hush no one asked us to use. On the bulletin board by the copier, someone had tacked a flyer for a community concert beneath the dogwood trees at the Memorial Garden. The paper corner had curled from the air conditioning, and every time I passed it, the corner flicked and settled like a slow signal. Lillian said she'd be there when the weather cooled. She liked to sit where the walking path bends, where the plaques catch evening light and run along the grass like coins. When we made time to talk, it was always late morning or just after lunch. She'd come with a scarf even when it was 80 degrees and ask if I wanted tea, which she pulled from her purse like a magician. I kept honey in my bottom drawer just for her. In my notes from those weeks, there's a line I circled twice and then forgot about until later. The route they loved wasn't the route they took. It came from a conversation with a ranger long since retired. We were swapping old maps for new ones, laying overlays on top of each other to watch the logging roads appear and vanish across decades. He tapped one stretch of forest and said, "Folks think that's the quick way to water, but it's downhill one way, and you pay the price on the return. Not worth it unless you're packing light or young enough to ignore your knees." We laughed. I wrote it down anyway. Sometimes a note knows what it's doing before you do. Detective work at my age is made out of small machines. A drawer that sticks unless you pull it just right. A printer that eats page 2 of a 3-page report like a dog with a sock. A key ring that reminds you how many doors you've been given permission to open. Most days, the work is tending those machines and moving the pieces of a story a few inches forward. Who paid cash? Who paid with coins? Who left a number that never worked again? When the old cases sit with you long enough, they change the way you see mundane things. I can't walk past a payphone stub in the concrete without checking for scraping around the coin slot. I glance at the strip along gas pumps where people rest their hands while they lean into the panel and listen for the click. Those marks talk if you give them a chance. Late that summer, I drove up to Granby on a personal day and stood under a faded canopy at a station that had seen more than its share of Augusts. The pavement was heat-buckled in places, patched with black seams that looked like old scars. Inside, the owner kept a roll of masking tape by the register to fix what broke in. The moment cracked candy rack loose sign a quarter of a window that rattled in the wind. He and I talked about water levels and road work and whether the elk would come down early that year. Before I left, he pointed to a measure mark on the cooler door jamb lines in ballpoint ink, years written beside them. He treats time like a growth chart. So do I. I measured that afternoon against a photo on my wall and didn't say why. Back in Boulder, the station cooled in the evenings to a perfect 68 degrees. Our janitor ran a floor fan in the hallway that sounded like steady rain. I'd stay an hour late to let the heat bleed out of the day and catch up on whatever paperwork stacked while I was gone. If you glanced in from the hall, you might think I was stalling, avoiding the way the night opens once you leave a bright building alone. But I was always waiting on something. An email from records, a callback from a license clerk, a ping from an archive terminal. Some nights, the waiting turns to habit. Other nights, it's instinct that keeps you in your chair until the second hand sweeps past the hour and you can say you tried. There's a type of quiet that arrives before change. It doesn't feel like silence. It feels like a room catching its breath. I noticed it first standing by my kitchen sink, watching the porch light throw a pale circle onto concrete while a moth beat itself against the glass. The weather had turned the wind flattening from the west, carrying the distant chop of helicopter blades that never came into view. I rinsed my mug and set it upside down to dry, listened for a neighbor's door, a car easing into a space, the ordinary cues that say the block is fine. They arrived on time, more or less. But a minute later, every sound seemed to tilt. My clock ticked a touch louder. The refrigerator motor came on with a deeper hum, and out beyond the balcony, a siren started, and then shut off before it found its note. The next day, the ash fell thicker. It left a soft gray halo on the hood of my car and the rim of the birdbath outside the station. People came in with their collars damp from breathing through wet cloth. Someone left a box of paper masks on the front desk with a handwritten sign, "Take one," because the warehouse shipment wouldn't arrive until Friday. In the stairwell, the air tasted like a match just blown out. I pinned a new map to my wall and narrowed my flags. I didn't know exactly why. Some things you prepare for without the benefit of reason. Toward the end of that week, the phone on my desk blinked a single light after hours. It could have been spam. It could have been a wrong number. I let it blink while I finished a paragraph in an email to evidence no drama, just a request for chain of custody clarification on a camera bag that once belonged to no one in particular. When I pressed the button and lifted the receiver, the message opened with the scrape of wind across a microphone and a man's voice clipped by static. He said his name like it wasn't important and gave me the miles marker first, then a description of the ground-burned slope, heat fracture steel in the dirt, where steel had no business being. He said he'd call back once they had a closer look. I put the receiver down and stood in the doorway of my office, letting the sound of the building tell me what to do. Down the hall, Lena's red light glowed through the half-closed door of the lab. The copier was quiet. Out in the lot, the street lamp hummed and the ash made the cones of light look like snow I couldn't touch. I turned off my fan and locked my cabinet. I left the window cracked an inch the way I always did so the room could breathe while I was gone. I told myself I'd go straight home, but I sat in my car and watched the porch lights come on up and down our block of brick and stucco, each one clicked by a timer or a hand, little suns in predictable orbits. Somewhere miles west, crews were walking blackened ground by the beam of headlamps' boot soles, testing the crust of cooled ash, looking for what had changed beneath the surface. I waited for my phone to ring, and it didn't. The light at the end of the block cycled through green, yellow, red, while the moths gathered around it like a quiet moving cloud. I turned the key and headed south. Windows cracked just enough to let in the smell of burned pine and left the porch light on at home longer than I needed to, as if the right beam could reach the ridge and show someone the way. By the time I reached the fire zone, daylight had turned a strange color somewhere between gold and gray. The air still carried the ghost of smoke, even though the flames were gone. It clung to your clothes, to your hair, even to the inside of your throat. The drive up had been slow, highway lined with charred slopes and fire trucks parked like sentinels along the shoulders. I'd been to burn zones before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just devastation. It was silence, the kind that waits. When I stepped out of my SUV, the ground gave under my boots like crushed chalk. Cal was waiting near the caution tape, his hard hat streaked with ash. He waved, then pointed toward a patch of blackened dirt where the terrain dipped unnaturally. "You're going to want to see this," he said. The hatch lay half buried in soot, its metal edges warped from the heat. MCC-12, the faded stenciling read. I brushed my glove over the letters, wondering why a mine that should have been sealed for 60 years was even here in a place that wasn't on any of our maps. When they cracked the seal earlier, Cal told me the air that came out was heavy, wet, and wrong. I leaned into the opening and clicked my flashlight. The beam caught a wall of darkness that seemed to breathe on its own. Just a few feet down, something pale glinted back. I climbed partway into the shaft, keeping one hand braced against the cool metal. My light found it again, a grocery bag sealed tight, half buried in dust. I used my pen to hook the edge and lift it free. Inside was a wallet, red leather, still pliable after 30 years of compression. The driver's license slid out easily. I didn't have to read the name twice. I stood there a long while with that wallet in my hand, listening to the forest creak and settle around us. Megan Doyle. It was as if the mountain had finally decided to return her. Cal asked if I was okay, and I said I was, though it didn't sound convincing. When I'd first inherited her file 3 years earlier, I'd thought of it as one of those quiet cases that would never find daylight again. 2 young people from Boulder who'd gone missing in the summer of '93, supposedly on a weekend trip to Mirror Lake. They never checked in. No car, no gear, no bodies. At the time, it had looked like any of a dozen backcountry vanishings accidents swallowed by time. But looking into that dark shaft, feeling the air move like something alive, I knew this wasn't nature's doing. Somebody had sealed them in, and whoever it was wanted them to stay gone. The climb back up felt longer than it should have. My hands came away black from the ladder. Cal showed me a folding table under a canopy where they'd laid out what they'd already pulled: a torn blue backpack, a rusted compass, a corroded flashlight, a flannel jacket that still carried a trace of red and gray thread at the cuff. Someone had tagged it probable male. I recognized it from the photo clipped inside Megan's file. Ryan Strickland wore that same jacket in nearly every picture lecture hall's trailheads family gatherings. He'd been 24 then, full of those restless plans graduate students make before life sets its limits. The edges of the fabric flaked as I turned it over. I asked about photographs, anything salvageable. Cal nodded toward a plastic evidence canister. "Camera," he said. "Film still sealed." I don't remember the drive back to Boulder, just the sound of gravel hitting the wheel wells and the quiet hum of the road that sometimes fills your head when words run out. I brought the film straight to our preservation lab. Lena was still there, sorting negatives under red light. She's one of those rare techs who never loses patience even when you hand her something that looks impossible. She held the canister up to the lamp, turning it slowly. "You might get lucky," she said. "Plastic kept it dry." I told her to take her time, but to do whatever it took to recover anything. She promised to call as soon as she had results. Back in my office, I unlatched the window an inch to let the night air in. Ash floated down through the street lights like snow that couldn't decide whether it wanted to fall. I spread Megan's file across the desk receipts, grainy photographs, the old gas station slip from August 21st, 1993. 11:27 a.m., Granby, $14.22, unleaded, paid in cash. That timestamp had been the last confirmed sighting of them. They should have reached their cabin near Mirror Lake by 2 that afternoon. They never arrived. Search teams had covered every marked trail in that region for weeks, but there had been no sign of their car. No footprints, nothing to suggest where they'd gone. Until now. When the phone rang, I almost didn't answer. It was late and the building was down to its hum, the vending machine in the hall, the slow creak of the vents. But I picked up. It was Cal again, his voice rough from smoke. "You'll want to come back up here," he said. "We sent a GoPro down deeper into the shaft. You need to see what's at the bottom. I was on the road within 20 minutes. The horizon glowed faintly red from the last embers of the wildfire as I climbed the grade toward Grand County. It was well past midnight when I reached the site. The floodlights were still burning, throwing hard shadows over the burned earth. Cal met me at the truck and led me to a small monitor propped on the tailgate. The footage was jerky shot on a pole-mounted camera that twisted with each movement. Timber beams slid past black with mold. Water dripped somewhere out of frame. At 4 minutes, the camera hit a sharp turn, then the beam caught something metallic wedged at an angle in the debris. It took a second to make sense of it. The grille of a car. The lens steadied, then moved closer. The shape resolved into a chassis white paint twisted frame half buried under rock and wood. One door was missing. The remaining side panel had a patch of color that might once have been red upholstery. Cal said quietly, "We ran the plate number through the old registry. It's a match. The 1993 white Ford Tempo rented under Ryan Strickland's name." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was wind moving across the ridge, thin and high, like someone breathing through their teeth. I felt my chest tighten the way it does when the body knows something before the mind catches up. 31 years those two had been listed as missing. 31 years of family birthdays, school years, entire lifetimes passing by, and the whole time their car had been sealed into a forgotten mine. "This was no accident," I said finally. Cal didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said he agreed. I stayed until first light, helping log the evidence before heading back to Boulder. By the time I reached the station, Lena was waiting outside the lab with a stack of photo paper drying under a fan. "You're not going to believe this," she said, motioning me inside. 6 photographs, each one clearer than I expected. The first showed Megan and Ryan in front of the car, smiling the kind of picture couples take before a weekend drive. The second was a close-up, Megan holding the camera at arm's length, sunlight washing half her face. The third was darker, a trail sign tagged with the words, "Danger Unmarked Shafts." Then came the fourth. Ryan sitting on a rock beside the car, his eyes turned away, brow furrowed. Behind him, in the corner of the frame, a faint silhouette. A man may be wearing a hat, just far enough that the features blurred. The fifth photo chilled the room. Megan inside the car, half lit by the flash, her mouth open as if mid-sentence. Behind her window, a hand pressed flat against the glass. Not hers. The last photo was nothing but black until Lena adjusted the exposure. Slowly a pattern emerged, metal grating bolts, maybe part of a barrier or door. We stood there in silence, the hum of the lab equipment filling the space between us. I heard myself whisper, "This isn't a hiking accident." Lena nodded once. "No," she said. "Somebody made sure they wouldn't leave." That night I gathered the cold case unit in the conference room. I pinned those 6 photos to the board one by one and told them what we'd found, the wallet, the car, the mine. Morgan leaned back with his arms crossed, eyes tracing the shadowed figure in the 4th photo. "We treat it as homicide until proven otherwise," he said. Everyone nodded. I volunteered to take point. It wasn't ambition. It was obligation. These cases live in you once you touch them. They don't go back to sleep. The next morning I drove out to Granby to the Shell station that still sat off Highway 34. The pumps were older now, paint peeling the price digits, sun-faded and stuck halfway through rotation. Inside, the same bell rang when I opened the door, the kind you only hear in small towns. The owner, Arnold Keller, came out from the back. Gray hair, heavy limp glasses that slipped down his nose every few seconds. When I mentioned the summer of '93, his expression turned cautious. I showed him a photo of Megan and Ryan at the car. He studied it, eyes narrowing. "They look familiar," he said slowly. "Might have seen them. That was a dry summer, lots of folks passing through. Fires up north even then." I slid him another photo, the one with the shadowed figure. His fingers hesitated on the edge. "That cap," he said, squinting. "Looks like a forestry hat, but not the official kind. We used to sell surplus gear right here. Locals bought it by the dozen." I asked if he remembered anyone particular who wore that kind of thing. He tapped the counter with one hand, thinking. "Guy named Boone. Lived out near Little Elk Creek. Stayed to himself. Used to buy jerky beer, sometimes film." That word film made my pulse pick up. I asked if he remembered a last name. He shook his head. "Just Boone. Trailer burned down late 90s. Never saw him again. I thanked him and was halfway to the door when he added quietly, "That mine they found." He hunted near there. Used to brag about knowing spots no ranger could find. Back in the car, I called our records unit and asked them to check for any property or complaints under the name Boone near Grand County in the early 90s. It didn't take long. One file popped up Boone T. Ledbetter 1956 birth year registered trespass complaint against federal personnel in 1991 for interfering near MCC 12, the same mine. My stomach tightened. He hadn't stumbled across it. He'd claimed it. By evening, I was back in my office piecing timelines together. Megan and Ryan last seen August 21st, 1993. Boone Ledbetter files a trespass claim 2 years before sighting the same area. The mine sealed officially in '66. None of it fit coincidence. I called Morales in records and told him to dig deeper, hunting licenses, arrests, any recent activity tied to that name. He promised to call as soon as he had something. I hung up and looked out my window at the line of porch lights climbing the hillside above town. For the first time in years, I felt that old shift in the air, the one that means you've moved from mystery into danger. The phone rang just after 10. Morales' voice carried a note I hadn't heard before. "We found him," he said. "Or something close. Name's been recycled Tim Boone on a fishing license 2 years ago. Same date of birth, same scar notation. He listed a contact address in Fremont County." I pulled a pad toward me. "Fremont." "Yeah," Morales said. "There's more. The address backs onto a decommissioned vertical shaft another mine." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over the front range, distant but steady. I drew a small circle on the pad around the words Fremont County and another around Boone Ledbetter, then connected them with a line. "Send me everything I said. He's not a ghost. He's just been underground longer than anyone thought." That night I left the station long after midnight. The streets were slick from a light rain that had fallen while we worked, cooling the pavement enough to steam under the lamps. I stood by my car and looked west. The mountains were dark, their outlines soft under low clouds. Somewhere out there between fire and ash, a door had been welded shut over the lives of 2 young people. And 31 years later it had opened again not by mercy, but by accident. Whatever we found next wouldn't stay buried much longer. The morning after Morales called, I drove out before sunrise. The sky was pale gray, the kind of color that makes the mountains look farther away than they are. My headlights caught the edges of dry grass bowing under the wind. Fremont County was almost 6 hours from Boulder, but the drive didn't feel long. There's a certain stillness you fall into when the road stretches out empty for miles. No radio, no phone, just the hum of tires and the faint ache behind your ribs that tells you something's waiting at the end. By the time I reached the dirt road that split toward the old hunting parcel, the sun was a weak gold line behind the ridges. Maddie rode beside me, flipping through a printout of property records. "No taxes filed since '99, she said. "Club dissolved after one of the founders died. Nothing since." I nodded eyes on the trail ahead. We were close. The map showed 2 parcels, one listed under the defunct Rock Valley Game and Gun Club, the other under a private alias tied to our suspect Tim Boone, which we now knew was Boone Ledbetter. The cabin appeared through the haze like a photograph left in water too long, blurred, soft-edged, half erased. The roof had caved in on one side, and the windows were just open holes. When we stepped out, the heat hit like a pulse. There was no wind, no birdsong, just the steady buzz of cicadas and the dry creak of our boots on clay. I remember how wrong the place smelled. It wasn't just dust or rot, it was chemical. Bleach faint, but unmistakable. Someone had been there recently. Maddie went right checking the perimeter while I pushed the door open with my shoulder. The hinge screamed once, then gave. Inside light spilled through a break in the roof, turning the air into a slow dance of dust. Everything looked frozen, mid-motion. A chair toppled, papers curled at the edges, a coffee tin lying on its side. A single desk sat against the far wall, its surface warped from years of heat. I pulled the drawer. It stuck, then slid open. Inside were scattered scraps, old hunting licenses, half-burned receipts, and a leather-bound ledger stamped faintly with the club's name. The first few pages were neat typed entries, rifle serials, member dues, dates. But halfway through the handwriting changed. It grew uneven, slanted, written by someone losing patience or sleep. I turned a page and froze. August 1993. Doe and Stag, delivered August 21st. Waited 3 days. Stag resisted. Put him in the pit. The ink bled slightly where the pen pressed too hard. The next entry was colder, almost detached. December 1993. Too cold. Bird won't eat. Sings in the dark. I flipped another page. May 1994. Quiet now. They always go quiet eventually. The hair on my arms stood up. Maddie came up behind me. "What is that?" she asked softly. I didn't answer right away. I turned one more page. It was a crude hand-drawn map showing the cabin, the forest, a thin ridge line, and an X marked vert shaft sealed. I traced the line with my finger. "That's where we're going next," I said. We followed the direction of that line on foot. The path wound through tall grass and low scrub, the ground cracked and sun-baked. After about 20 minutes, we found it a mound of rocks and rusted metal half hidden by brush. When we cleared the debris, a cement ring appeared thick with moss. In the center was a heavy steel plate chained shut with a lock. I knelt and brushed away the dirt. The chain wasn't ancient. It was new, at least within the last few years. Someone had been guarding this. Maddie crouched beside me, her flashlight catching something near the base of the ring. A small yellow-toothed human, the root still intact. She looked at me and didn't have to say anything. I radioed it in. Within hours, we had a forensic crew and ground-penetrating radar over the site. By dusk, the readings came back metal at mid-depth irregular shapes, a possible cavity along one wall. That meant structure or bodies or both. That night, I sat under the canvas of the command tent as the dig team rigged a tripod over the shaft. The air was heavy, the kind that sticks to your skin. I stared at the ledger we'd pulled from the desk, sealed now in plastic. Each nickname, Bird, Stag, Maple, June, felt deliberate, not random. It was a way of reducing people to categories of stripping their names. I'd seen it before in other cases, control through language. The difference here was the detail. Whoever wrote this had a system, a calendar of suffering. I kept reading, hoping to find an end, but the pages only grew darker. At the bottom of one entry, written smaller than the rest, was a note that said, "He says I keep them too long." It made my throat tighten. He. That single word changed everything. Around midnight, Morales called from Boulder. "We've got movement," he said. "DMV records just hit. Boone Ledbetter's expired license was flagged in a phishing database 2 years ago, registered under the name Tim Boone. Address lists a P.O. box in Fremont County, but there's a secondary contact, some rural property outside Canyon City. I asked if it was still active. No taxes filed, no recent utilities," he said. "But the parcel backs up against another decommissioned mine." I didn't say anything for a moment, just listened to the static hum through the line. "Send me everything I said, finally. He's not done." We reached that property by late morning the next day. The road was barely a road anymore, just 2 worn ruts winding through sage and stone. The heat shimmered above the hood of the SUV, blurring the horizon. When the shack came into view, it was smaller than I expected, just a rectangle of wood and tin sagging against the hillside. We approached, slow, weapons holstered but ready. Inside, the air was stale, no wildlife sounds at all, as if the place held its breath. A layer of dust coated everything except one strip of floor that looked freshly swept. Maddie moved toward a set of shelves, tracing her flashlight over stacked boxes. I went to a desk in the corner. On top was another ledger, similar to the one we found before, but thicker, heavier. The first pages listed the same mundane hunting data, but toward the back, the handwriting changed again. Different hand this time, smaller, steadier. The words were sharp, deliberate. September 1993. Doe and stag processed. Pattern stable. Bird remains unpredictable. The next line stopped me cold. The mine is full. We'd barely processed that when a call came from the team at the shaft. They'd broken into a lower chamber, a sealed-off pocket dug into the side wall. Inside were personal items, a woman's necklace with a bird-shaped pendant, a Polaroid photo curled from age, and a small notebook wrapped in cloth. The photo showed a woman sitting on a log, her wrists resting on her knees. The figure standing behind her was little more than a shadow. The pendant matched the one Megan wore in the last photo recovered from her camera roll. I felt my pulse in my throat. The notebook was worse. Most pages were blank, but about halfway through were scattered entries written in jagged, almost childlike script. August 23rd. She stopped crying today. He says that means we're making progress. A few lines down. August 28th. I hate the sound they make when they sleep. And then circled in red ink, the woman with the bird necklace. She didn't scream when the door shut. She just stared at me. I think she knew. I read it twice then, once more. The words weren't confessions. They were records. Whoever wrote them believed he was documenting a process. I slid the notebook into an evidence bag and handed it off. As I stood to leave, the air shifted cooler, heavier, like the mountain itself had inhaled. We'd been standing over that pit all day without knowing what it truly was, not just a mine, but a burial system. A pattern of capture-punishment silence. And the more we uncovered, the clearer it became that Boone wasn't the only one keeping score. Back at the tent, I spread both ledgers side by side under the light. The handwriting told a story, Boone's early entries frantic and erratic, followed by this second author who treated the acts like inventory. Boone might have started the violence, but someone else had refined it, structured it, given it order. The idea of two hands on the same cruelty made my stomach turn. I was still studying the differences when Morales radioed in again. "We've located Boone Ledbetter," he said. "Or at least someone using his old alias. The ID matches the license cross-checks. He's alive." My breath caught. "Where?" I asked. "Just outside Canyon City," Morales said. "And get this, his secondary property backs right up to that Rock Valley parcel you're standing on." For a long time after that call, I just sat there listening to the low drone of the generators outside the tent. The heat had broken, and the first cool wind since the fires swept through the valley. Somewhere down in the dark beyond, where the radar could read, lay the last pieces of Megan and Ryan's story, hidden behind concrete and rock. But now, there was a trail, a man still breathing, still moving, who had once held the keys to that sealed world. I thought of Lillian back in Boulder, her voice soft when she said she'd never stopped setting a place for her daughter at Christmas. 31 years of waiting. Maybe we were finally close enough to tell her the truth, though I wasn't sure yet if that truth would offer peace or just another kind of ache. Before turning in, I walked out to the edge of the ridge. The sky was the color of iron clouds rolling over the peaks to the west. In the distance, lightning flashed, and for a moment the entire landscape lit up charred trunks, rusted tools, the open mouth of the mine gleaming faintly in the dark. It struck me then that what we were dealing with wasn't buried at all. It had been sitting there the whole time, waiting for the right season to expose itself. As I stood there, the first drops of rain began to fall cold and scattered, tapping against my jacket like fingers on a door. I looked back toward the tent, where the evidence bags lay drying under light, the ledgers sealed, the Polaroid face down. We weren't done, not by a long shot. And I had the feeling that the next step, the one that would finally open this case up, wouldn't come from what was found in the ground, but from someone still above it, someone who'd learned to live with what they'd done. By the time I made it back to Grand County, the rain had burned itself out, leaving the air thin and electric. The clouds hung low enough to scrape the ridgeline, and everything charred stumps, scorched gravel. Even the steel mouth of the mine looked washed clean and strange, as if the land itself had paused to exhale. The crews were already packing up for the night when I arrived, their headlamps glowing faintly through the fog. One of the techs waved me toward a folding table under the canopy. On it sat a small cloth-wrapped bundle and an evidence slip marked Recovered Subchamber B. I eased the wrap open and saw the object inside a cassette, the old kind with 2 small reels and a faded label marked in black pen. Just 3 characters, M, 828.93. I don't remember breathing for a long moment. It felt like the air around me thinned until there was only that tape and the weight of what it might hold. Maddie was beside me, her face pale in the floodlight. We found it wedged in a crack behind the cot, she said quietly. Looked like it had been wrapped in cloth and sealed in place. Her voice was steady, but her eyes said the rest. Whoever left it had meant for someone to find it, just not right away. I slipped the cassette into an evidence bag and signed the chain of custody form. Then I called Lena. I need playback capability analog, I told her. She didn't ask why. She just said, I'll have something ready when you get back. The drive to Boulder that night felt endless. I kept my window cracked, the cold air biting my knuckles where they rested on the wheel. My headlights swept over the dark ribbon of highway, catching the shine of guardrails and the glassy eyes of elk frozen on the shoulder. The storm clouds had broken by then, and far-off lightning stitched the sky over the peaks. I remember thinking how those flashes looked like the light from an old projector, brief, imperfect, but real. Somewhere out there, Megan had been alive long enough to press record. That thought kept me from blinking too long. When I reached the lab, the building was quiet, except for the hum of the ventilation. Lena had pulled an old micro-cassette recorder from storage, its plastic yellowed with age. She'd already spooled the tape onto fresh reels to prevent snapping. It's fragile, she said, but it should play. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. The room was dim except for the lamp over her workstation, its circle of light cutting a small island in the dark. She pressed play. At first, there was only static, soft, rhythmic, like a breath caught inside the machine. Then a voice rose through it, faint but clear enough to recognize as a young woman. "My name is Megan Doyle," she said. Her tone was calm, deliberate, but there was something in it, a tremor just below the words, the sound of someone who's made peace with what can't be changed. If someone's hearing this, I don't know how much time I have. There was a faint clicking in the background. Maybe footsteps, maybe tools. "He calls me Bird," she continued. "I don't know why. I haven't seen Ryan in 4 days. I think he's..." A pause, breath catching. "He keeps saying he's making us better, that we were chosen because we stopped." Then a choked inhale followed by the smallest whisper. "If this tape survives me, please find my mother. Her name is Lillian Doyle. She lives in Boulder. Tell her I didn't forget her." The sound cut off, there replaced by static and the faint scrape of movement before the tape wound to its end. No screams, no final words, just silence so dense it pressed against your ears. When Lena stopped the machine, the room stayed still. Neither of us spoke. After a long moment, she said, "That's her. It has to be." I nodded. There was nothing else to say. I carried the digital copy to the command tent at dawn. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, and the ground was damp under my boots. The team gathered quietly Morales Maddie, a few of the forensic techs. I set the player on the table and hit play again. They listened the same way I had, their faces flattening as the words unfolded, the silence at the end stretching longer each time. When it finished, Morales leaned back, rubbing his jaw. She recorded her own captivity, he said. The words hung in the air like smoke. She wanted someone to hear her, I said, to know she fought. By midday, we'd sent the audio to the Department of Justice for voice verification. 90 minutes later, the result came through a 100% match to Megan Doyle. It was official. The mine wasn't just a burial site. It was a prison. And Boone Ledbetter, or whoever he'd been working with, had made it both. That evening, I sat in my apartment, the tape still echoing in my mind. I poured a cup of coffee that went cold before I touched it. The city lights bled through the blinds, thin stripes across the wall. I pulled out the ledger we'd recovered, the one with 2 different handwritings, and stared at the final line. The pattern begins with silence. I thought about Megan's words, about how she'd chosen to fill her silence with a voice. Maybe she knew the only way to survive, even after death, was to be heard. The next morning, Morales called again. "You're not going to like this," he said. "We found something in the old missing persons archive. It's a file on a woman named Hannah Clare. Vanished in 1998 west of Colorado Springs. 22 years old." He paused. "She was wearing a carved wooden bird pendant when she disappeared." I gripped the edge of my desk. "That detail ever released to the public?" "No," he said. "It's buried in the intake notes, never made the press." I closed my eyes. Then whoever took her knew about Megan. We re-examined the evidence from the shaft that night, and what we found confirmed it. Inside one of the rusted boxes pulled from the lower chamber were several Polaroids, dozens, really each dated and labeled with nicknames. Bird, 1993, 1994. Maple, 1996. June, 1998. The images showed women sitting or lying on cots, some looking straight into the lens, others staring somewhere beyond it. Every photo had the same composition, a bare bulb overhead, a wall of vertical planks behind them, and that same hollowness in their faces. None of them smiled. One of the later photographs, the one dated 98, showed a woman who matched Hannah's description. Her pendant was the same carved bird. I remember how quiet the chamber was when we found those prints. Even the air seemed to pull back from the light. Boone hadn't been documenting victims. He'd been archiving them, naming them like species, tracking their endurance, their silence, their submission. And now the timeline stretched farther than anyone expected. This wasn't a single outburst of violence. It was a cycle. Late that night, I went back through the second ledger, the one we'd taken from the Canyon City property. Near the middle, written in smaller script, was a line I hadn't noticed before. I tried to keep Bird. I really did. But she was too clever, too quiet. I never found where she hid the tape. My pulse kicked hard. Megan's cassette hadn't been a message in panic. It was a calculated act of resistance. She'd hidden proof knowing someone might find it years later. And if she'd done that once, there might be more. The next morning, we sent a small team back into the mine with her last entry from Boone's journal as a guide. The note she'd written. "The bird sang before she flew" sounded poetic at first, but I'd learned to read survivors' language differently. It wasn't poetry, it was a map. The phrase pointed to a specific wall near the second cot, the place where the tape had been found. I joined the crew underground, the temperature dropping as we descended. The rock was slick, the air metallic and stale. We reached the cot, its frame half rusted, the mattress collapsed in on itself. I ran my hand along the wall behind it until my glove caught on a small chip in the stone. Beneath that, wedged in a narrow groove, was something wrapped in cloth. I pulled gently until it came free. Another cassette identical to the first, its label barely visible but legible enough, M82993. Back at the surface, I watched as Lena prepped it for playback. The room smelled faintly of ozone and dust. When the tape began, the sound came through clearer this time, as if Megan had recorded it closer to the mic. "It's raining," she said, voice trembling but steady. "He says the mine keeps us safe, that the fire will pass, and then we'll be better. I can hear the water dripping. It sounds like counting." There was a pause, then a faint thud. Maybe a stone kicked or dropped. "If you find this," she whispered, "tell her I tried to go." "I tried." Then, barely audible, "He says I can leave if I sing." The tape cut there. We didn't need to guess what happened next. Boone had probably realized she'd hidden the first recording, maybe even caught her trying to make another. The fact that the second tape ended mid-sentence told me she'd never been allowed to finish. Afterward, we sent a team to re-examine the surrounding ground near the ridge above Mirror Lake, following the map Megan had left in her last letter. The search was slow, methodical, sifting through layers of burned debris and gravel. Near what used to be the tree line, a technician called out. Beneath a shallow layer of soil, they'd uncovered a small metal tin. Inside was a folded sheet of paper sealed in a cracked Ziploc bag. The writing was faint. The ink bled, but it was hers. She'd written it before the end. In it, she said she'd hidden the tape behind the wall and that if it was ever found, it meant he never came back. "Tell my mother," it read. I remember the sound of her singing by the kitchen window. That's what kept me alive. When I finished reading it, the wind came up hard across the ridge, and for a moment, I swear I could hear it, just the faintest echo of a melody moving through the burned trees. Maybe it was my mind filling in what I needed to believe, but I prefer to think it was something else. A woman's voice carried farther than she ever meant it to go. That night I met with Lillian at the station. I played the tape for her myself. She sat perfectly still as Megan's voice filled the room, her hands folded tight in her lap. When it ended, she didn't cry. She just whispered, she remembered. I told her her daughter had fought until the very end, that she hadn't given in. Lillian nodded once. Then she won, she said. And I believed her. After she left, I sat alone with the caseboard. Megan, Ryan, Hannah, the others whose names we didn't yet know. All threads of the same dark fabric woven through decades and silence. Boone might have started it, but there was another hand guiding him, someone who believed the pattern belonged to him. That thought wouldn't let me sleep. I kept replaying the last line in Boone's journal. He says the pattern belongs to him, but he doesn't understand it was never his. I looked up at the wall of faces one more time. The storm outside was breaking again, rain drumming against the glass. Somewhere out there, another man was waiting in the dark, guarding what was left of the pattern. And by then, I knew exactly what the next call would bring. When the call finally came, it was a Tuesday morning, cool and windless, the kind of day when even the birds seemed slow to start. Morales's voice came through the line with that flat steadiness he only used when something heavy had settled in. "They found him," he said. For a second, I didn't ask who some part of me already knew. He gave the location a cabin near the edge of Fremont County, about 10 miles from the property we'd searched before. I remember sitting there, phone in my hand, staring at the steam from my coffee rising like smoke. I thought about Megan's voice on that tape, how calm she'd sounded even at the edge of her life, and how somewhere, maybe not so far, the man who took it from her had been sleeping under the same sky. We rolled out before noon, Maddie driving Morales behind us with a convoy. The road was narrow-cut deep through brush and shale, the kind that turns your tires gray with dust. The place came into view like something time had forgotten. A sagging porch roof bowed under the weight of years, one window boarded from the inside. A single plume of smoke rose from a rusted chimney. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the wind shifted, carrying a low sound music, faint, almost tuneless, It was humming, a man's voice. I'll never forget the way it trembled in and out like he couldn't decide whether he wanted to be heard. The entry was quiet practiced. No shouting, no chaos. Just doors opening, boots on wood, the click of safety releases. When I stepped inside, my eyes had to adjust. The light came in through cracks in the boards falling across dust and old furniture. The smell was sharp mold sweat and something metallic underneath. On a cot against the far wall sat a girl teenage barefoot. Her hair tangled her eyes wide but dry. She didn't speak. She just kept humming that same sound, soft and steady, like she was trying to keep herself anchored. Maddie moved to her side, speaking gently, wrapping her in a blanket. I turned toward the cellar door, already open. A narrow set of steps led down into a concrete pit, the walls lined with photographs, hundreds of them curling at the corners. Faces of women, all ages, all caught by the same camera. In the center of the room sat a man older now, hair gone to white at the temples, hands folded in his lap like he was waiting for church to begin. He looked up as I reached the bottom. "She sang," he said quietly, almost smiling. She never stopped singing. There was no rage in him, no fear. Just that eerie calm I'd heard once before in Boone's words, in the ledgers, in every trace of this sickness that had carried on long after the first body hit the ground. He told us his name was Emery Talcott. The journals confirmed it later. He'd met Boone in the early 90s, worked with him on restoration crews, both obsessed with old mine systems, both convinced the land was swallowing people who needed to be saved. Boone had been the brute, the executioner. Talcott, the disciple who turned it into ritual. When Boone disappeared after the fires, Talcott kept the pattern alive. New victims, new recordings, new rules. What he said to us in that basement was almost word for word what Boone had written 30 years earlier. They all go quiet, eventually. It's the quiet that keeps them pure. I remember stepping closer, not because I wanted to hear more, but because I needed to see what kind of man could say something like that and still look human. He just looked old, ordinary, small. Monsters rarely announce themselves, they just keep breathing. The rest moved quickly, arrest transport evidence sealed and tagged. The girl from the cot, her name was Elise, was taken to a hospital in Canyon City. She'd been missing 3 weeks. Her mother arrived that night shaking so hard she couldn't sign the intake forms. I stood in the hallway while she thanked the nurses, her voice trembling with relief and disbelief all tangled together. That's the part of this work no one prepares you for, not the horror itself, but the shock of goodness breaking through after so much rot. Back in Boulder, the case turned into headlines for a while. The mine keeper, the pattern killer. They wrote it like a ghost story because that's easier to swallow than the truth that a man can disappear into the cracks of our country and stay there decades deep unnoticed. Talcott was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, among other things. The evidence from the mine, Megan's recordings, the journals, the Polaroids was enough to bury him without a confession. But he confessed anyway. In detail. Cold, methodical, almost academic. When the trial came, he didn't fight it. He sat through every day like he was attending his own lecture. The sentence was life without parole. When it was read, he nodded once like a man who'd already known the answer. Lillian sat beside me in the front row. She wore a small silver locket with Megan's picture inside, the same smile that had stared out from the photos we'd studied for months. When the gavel came down, she closed her eyes and exhaled through her nose, slow and steady. Not triumph, just release. Afterward, she turned to me and said, "You found her voice. That's enough." I wanted to tell her it didn't feel like enough, that no verdict could undo what 31 years had taken from her. But I kept quiet. Some silences aren't empty. They're the only space where truth can rest. After the sentencing, I went back to the site one last time. The mine had been sealed again. Concrete poured thick over the entrance. The land around it was trying to heal stubborn little shoots of green pushing up through the ash. Cal met me there leaning on a shovel. He said the reclamation team would reroute the runoff, let the forest reclaim what it could. Places like this, he said, they don't forget easy, but they do grow back. We stood there a long while watching the clouds roll in from the west. The air smelled like rain again. A few weeks later, I drove to Boulder's Memorial Garden. Lillian had asked the city for permission to add a plaque beneath the dogwood tree where the summer concerts used to be. When I arrived, the ground was still soft from recent watering. The plaque was simple bronze, small, nothing fancy. It read, "In memory of Megan Doyle, 1971-1993. She sang louder than the silence. Someone had placed a small carved bird beside it, worn smooth from touch. I sat on the bench across from it, listening to the faint sounds of traffic and the wind moving through the branches. Every so often I thought I heard that same low humming from the cabin, just the sound of the wind, I'm sure, but it carried the same rhythm, the same defiance. I've kept the tapes all these years, or rather copies of them. The originals are sealed in evidence, but I keep the digital versions locked away, not out of morbid curiosity, but as a reminder. People ask sometimes why I still do this work after everything I've seen. I tell them because silence has weight, and stories, real ones, are the only way to lift it. When you hear someone's voice carried across decades through dirt and darkness, it changes the way you think about what justice really means. It's not about punishment. It's about being heard. Lena retired last spring. Morales moved to missing persons in Denver. Maddie's still out there working wilderness cases, the kind that start with a footprint and end in questions that don't always have answers. As for me, I still keep a map on my wall dotted with pins, some red, some blue, a few white for the ones that came home. Every so often I run my finger over the one marked Grand County and think about the mine, about how close it came to staying buried forever. And then I remember Megan sitting somewhere in that dark, pressing record, leaving behind proof that the human spirit doesn't vanish easy. Not long ago, I got a letter from Lillian. She's living with her sister in New Mexico now, near a small church that looks out over a dry field. She said the mornings are quiet there, and sometimes she still hears a song she can't name drifting on the wind. She thinks it's her daughter's voice carried farther than anyone thought possible. I don't know if that's true, but I hope it is. These cases never leave you. They change shape like light shifting through water, but they never fade. You learn to carry them carefully like fragile things that still have a pulse. And if you're lucky, they teach you something simple and impossible at the same time, that even in the darkest places a voice can survive. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for noise, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.